So we're very glad to be in conversation today with Helena Alviar García. She's a professor at Sciences Po Paris, and she's a Fernand Braudel Fellow at the European University Institute. Welcome, Helena.
Thank you.
So I would like to begin this interview by asking you about your academic journey and intellectual influences. So your academic journey has led you to work on and explore the intersection of various fields, including comparative law and development, feminism, transitional justice. So I would like to ask you what have been your main intellectual influences as a scholar, which works have had a significant impact on you, and whether in these works if you have found a common theoretical framework or a legal theory that has allowed you to navigate all these areas productively.
Okay. Well, thank you both for taking the time to be here and do this short interview with me. So my academic journey is that I studied law at Universidad de los Andes, and then a few years later, I started first a master's. Originally, I just went with the idea of doing a master's degree. And then during the master's, because when I studied law, I think that is something a little bit shocking, but when I studied law, there were no full-time professors. There were two who did it full-time because they wanted to, because they had resources or they were practitioners and they dedicated a lot of time to academia, but out of their voluntary, out of like solidarity for the institute or for teaching in a way. And I had never imagined that you could dedicate your life and live with a salary that allows you to live as being a full-time academic. So I went to do my master's. And one of the reasons I wanted to do my master's to go abroad was because I studied law because I had a very strong sense of justice. I wanted to see social justice, justice in the world, etc. But I entered the law school in 1984, and I never heard the word justice in my almost 5 years career. Never. Because it was all about, this is the content of the law, this is how you apply the law, these are the rules and interpretations. Even though Los Andes Law School was supposed to be more flexible and more into the Socratic method, etc., changing the way you teach law is something that is very difficult. And so I was actually very frustrated with the type of education that I got. So much so that at the university where I studied, you could take courses in other disciplines. And I took a course on literature. And I thought, no, I'm going to study literature. I'm going to drop law and I'm just going to go and study literature. But for personal reasons, I decided not. I was in the middle of my career. My mother was a widow, so I stayed. But I always longed for an education that was more academic, more about ideas, less about only doctrinal studying about doctrinal stuff, etc. And so I went to do my master's at Harvard, which wasn't progressive paradise either, I have to say, but I did find some interesting discussions, and I wrote an LLM thesis. While I was writing the thesis, I thought, well, this process of writing is something I really like writing, not only the artisanal work of having an idea and transforming it, but also the rhythm of writing and researching, etc. So I decided to apply to the doctorate degree. Now, at that time, they had never accepted a Latin American woman to the doctorate program at Harvard Law School.
Yeah.
Of course, it had to do in part also because in my generation, not a lot of women were doing doctorates. First of all, because we didn't know what you could do with a doctorate. And second, because the women who went, many women stayed at home. Just to give you an example, most of my contemporary friends from law school never worked or never, or never worked outside of the household, actually. I should clarify. In any case, I studied at Harvard Law School. I did my doctorate on law development and gender. I concentrated on agrarian reform, and I did a comparison between Cuba and Colombia. And my thesis advisor was Duncan Kennedy. So Duncan Kennedy had an enormous influence on my thinking, and everything that Duncan Kennedy and his contemporary, colleagues who were members of critical legal studies had created, which was the critical legal studies. By the time I got there, Duncan loved to say critical legal studies is dead, but for me, it was very much alive. And so I would say that was my biggest influence. But because I was very interested also in women's rights, at that time, I would call it women's rights, feminism, feminist theory in general was very interesting. So a very big influence. So the work of Duncan Kennedy, but also the work of Robert Gordon, the work of David Kennedy, who's a person I admire profoundly. And I think his work and Duncan's have been very influential in the way I theorize and think about things. Lucy White, with whom I did one of the fields. But also, traditional feminists like Catherine McKinnon, Nancy Fraser, of course, is a big hero of mine. Chandra Mohanty, who's a third world feminist. I mean, so feminists also were a very big influence. Now, when I repeat these names right now, I think, oh my God, most of them are white, either men or white women, but that has changed, and I'll mention that in a bit. Dependency theory was very important for me because as a Latin American, I wanted to foreground or bring to bear the insights of dependency theory that I've always found interesting and very useful, especially the idea that because I was working on economic development has this ahistorical characteristic to it. Like if you do these things, you're going to develop. And dependency theory brought in the idea that it's not ahistorical, it's completely historical. But when I arrived to Colombia, and I think that that's a very interesting thing when you study abroad as a person from the global south, and we can have a conversation about what I mean by that, but I mean by that something more political than geographical. You bring all these insights that you learned in these universities, and you have to, which is a very difficult task, but also a very interesting one. You have to understand which of those critical insights are useful for the country and the region you've come to, and which of them are not, which of them are going to be politically important and relevant, are going to move the discussion in one way, and which ones are actually going to be detrimental for political discussions in the country. And so, and there, I think that since I went to Colombia, of course, I read my contemporaries, my colleagues, my intellectual companion, Jose Isabel Jaramillo, who both I've read and we've worked together many times, but also students of the first generation who are now scholars on their own, Lina Uccelli, scholars from Latin America, Paula Vergallo. Because I lived in Latin America for most of my academic life, many of the scholars that I read were scholars from that region. We can talk a little bit about that. And there, the diversity, the theoretical diversity there was more different diversity. So more center liberals, more pure Marxists. And it depended a bit on the struggle that I was doing. But I would say that my main influences, just to recap, because this has been like a long answer, would be critical legal studies, dependency theory, feminist theory, and feminist theory from the global south.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Thanks.
Thank you for the answer. And so I'm going to have like a more specific question about your lecture of yesterday night. That was really interesting. So in the lecture, actually, you brought a critique that you made in other cases, which is the critique of the language of rights. And you linked it in that lecture to the question of nature and the protection of nature and the limits of this discourse or the possibilities of this discourse. So I have my more general question would be, why did you choose to move to the question of nature at this point of your career? Because you worked a lot about that. And how was the path that brought you from your first questioning of the language right in transitional justice and property rights to the one of the protection of nature?
Okay, excellent question. Thank you very much. So I think four things led me to the question of nature. The first one, and I'm not going to say them in order necessarily, but the first one is that you can't hide from the issue of climate degradation. I mean, like when I was growing up, it was a bit of a question because when I was in Bogota, and when I was in school, there was a conversation. Bogota is a city that is up, and so there was a whole conversation about the fact that there was erosion in the mountain, and sometimes when it rained too much, some neighborhoods were flooded, etc. So there was this thing about you should plant trees. So I would say like that's an initial, but you could think about it or not. I think that now in 2024, in March of 2024, it's unavoidable. It's something that you think about. I think about it every single day. I think about it in terms of this amount of consumption is unsustainable. Look at all the plastic that is being produced, etc. But it's also, in terms of, the global warming. I live in the city of Paris, where the city of Paris, it's air conditioning is not allowed, and of course, there's a whole thing about air conditioning shouldn't be allowed, but Paris has become even in late May and early June, it can get very hot. And so you can see the effects of global warming. So just like on a physical, or places that I went as a child, the beaches in the Caribbean, where my mother was from the Caribbean. So those beaches are now other things, right? So it's something that I've experienced, and so I found it very pressing. But initially, I didn't want to do anything about it because there's something about this discussion that is very paralyzing. I feel that it's been framed in a way like it's either like catastrophe, we're done, let's forget it. And so it's paralyzing. I can't do anything, right? But I don't like that way of thinking that you can't. And so I started to think so that's one of the reasons, right? The physical, that you can't deny it. But also because I worked on land and agrarian reform, because in my dissertation, I wanted the original question of my dissertation was, well, along with economic development. And when I started my dissertation, I wanted to work on law and development. At that time, this was 1997, at Harvard Law School, nobody wanted to work on law and development because there had been a law and development movement in the 60s. And they had already thought, no, that law and development movement is over. And I remember vividly that I went to Duncan Kennedy and I told him, listen, I want to apply to the doctorate. I want to do something on law and development. And he was like, no, but law and development, I don't care that much about law and development. It's over. And I told him, I'm not asking you if you think it's over or it's good or it's bad. I'm asking you, would you advise me to write a dissertation on law and development? I'm not asking you if you know a lot about it, a little bit about it. And he said yes, because I had always found him very fascinating and very politically engaged. But and it wasn't only related to me, there were a couple of two other people who were working on law and development at the same time. There was like a revival of law and development. But when I started working on law and development, I still had faith on the idea of economic development in a way, as I mentioned before. but I wanted to ground the dissertation on something, and I thought agrarian reform is the perfect thing, because I thought at the time, and I still think in a way that too, that a very important way to redistribute resources in society is through redistributing land property. And so I wrote my dissertation. But in that conversation about agrarian reform, it's actually very interesting because it's not only about giving land to people, it's also about what type of production you're doing in a place. What are the crops that are being allowed to be cultivated, which ones are not, etc. And so that has an environmental dimension, even though at the time I didn't understand it as an environment directly, like I didn't say, oh, this is environmental. But now I think, of course, this was about environment. It was about water production, where you can cultivate, etc. And it had a very specific gender dimension. That was the one that interested me the most, which is how can you give access to property for women? And so there was a lot of conversations about women as subsistence producers, what do women do, etc. So those were things that, even though at the time I couldn't put my finger on the term environment, they were the things that led me to get into that. And then the last reason I would mention, which is personal, and maybe it's the first one, which is that my youngest son is an environmental scientist. And he has been very active in environmental issues since he was, in his 50, when he was 14, 15. And initially, because I'm like a boxing partner with my children, I used to contradict him, like, oh, so in developing countries, climate change, we should be more worried about production because we have to give work to the people and blah, blah, blah. And in those sparring moments, actually, he managed to convince me in a way of or meaning that the tension that I was seeing between production and environmental protection was not the contradiction that, I was trying to not fight with him, just challenge him intellectually, because it's the style of mothering I do. And I think that that was also very important for me, the fact that he felt so passionate about it. I've always tried to find my sons at a place where they're interested, not that they have to be interested in what I think, but that I have to be interested in what they think. So that's the last reason I would say.
And this is just a little follow-up question on
Sure.
this point. It's you said like you were seeing a tension between production and the protection of environment. And my follow-up question is about exactly why did you saw this antagonism? Is it because we have like such a neoliberal structure of international law and of national law that basically antagonize them for us, that we have like the impression that?
So I think, so there are two answers to your question, to your very interesting follow-up. So the first, and this is, so my first inclination is actually a very important argument that many left members of the left, policymakers, etc., in Latin America say, which is, and on the right, but it is, oh, Europe, when you industrialized, you ended everything, or the US, and you made a lot of wealth, and now that's why you have the quality of life you can have everywhere. And we, who couldn't do that because we were under conditions of colonialism or neocolonialism, now we have to take care of the world. Now, for example, and even though I'm far from being in agreement with Bolsonaro, but Bolsonaro told Macron, what are you talking about? The Amazon is Brazilian. It's not yours. It's ours. Now, I am not defending Bolsonaro. I want to make that clear. But what I'm saying is that even people on the left are, in the case of the Rio Atrato, which is the case that yesterday I spoke about, granting the rights to the Atrato River, and some communities in the Atrato River say, we want the river to be productive, because we need salaries, we need resources, people need to eat. We can't be just taking care of the environment because we need resources. in an article I wrote about women and climate change, specifically women in the flower industry, women want to take care of the environment, but they also are saying we need to produce because we need to eat, to, survive. And so that would be one part of the conversation, which I always told him. And in a way, I still believe a bit of that. And I think that that's a big tension in Europe, which is sometimes being environmentally conscious requires resources. You have to have, I mean, they're like, no, don't eat those things that have pesticides. Well, yeah, if you can pay, I don't know,
Organic.
double for the organic chicken or double for, right? And so that part of the tension, I still think there's a luxury there that not everybody can have. And I also think that there's like a moral high ground to the I'm protecting the environment and blah blah blah. And some people don't have the choice, right? Now, other people are much more conscious about how to take care of the environment because they're living the environment. Many women, for example, know how to take care of water resources, but precisely because they know how to produce what is needed to be produced. So that's the first. But I totally agree with you that precisely it is because of the economic development model that comes from neoliberalism, from transnational neoliberalism, that it's creating a lot of pressure on producing goods ad infinitum, goods that are also many go to the waste basket because people have more food that they should eat, or, serve themselves more food that they can eat or whatever. And since I've been studying environmental issues, the feminists say consciousness raising is so important, right? Like there's a point at which, as a feminist, there's a point at which you see the feminist insight and then you can never see the world again. It's exactly the same with the environment, which is once you see the link between, for example, capitalist production and environmental degradation, you can't unsee it, right? So when you just everywhere you see, for example, in tourism, everything it's inseparable from a capitalist form of production. So totally agreed.
Thanks. Very interesting points. Thank you for that. So I'm going to move the focus from your research to your role as a teacher. You have taught across the globe. Of course, you have an established career as a professor in Colombia. You have been a visiting professor at Harvard Law School, and now you teach at Sciences Po Paris. And additionally, you were the dean of Los Andes Law School, one of Latin America's most prominent law schools from 2011 to 2016. And may I add, you were the first female dean, right?
Yes.
So I wanted to ask you what you believe is the role of legal education. In which ways do you think that legal education constrains, and in which ways can we think of legal education as emancipatory? And also, how has your understanding of the role of legal education and its potential evolved over the years?
Thank you. So I have thought a lot about my role as a professor. And one of the things that I think is that you don't teach the content of something, you teach how you're transmitting it. So sometimes we're obsessed, they have to know rule number 34 or, Article 13 of the Constitution, the Colombian Constitution that establishes equality, etc. But they'll forget that when they leave the classroom. I mean, that it was Article 13 or whatever. But they'll remember that if they were engaged in a question or in looking with their own minds at a specific topic. So the first thing two things that I think are essential to my teaching. The first one is that the classroom is a democratic space. Now, does that mean that they can do whatever they want, and if they don't read, no. It means that I'm learning from them as much as they are learning from me. And it's consistent. I mean, constantly, I learn from my students, and not only students, of course, when you give a talk, etc. But we're talking about the classroom. In the classroom, I learn from my students as much, I would say even more than what I am able to teach them. And the reason, and students, so for example, France is has a very traditional way of teaching. And the traditional way of teaching is that there's a professor, he or she comes in, they talk for 50 minutes, and then the students ask questions. And mostly the students ask questions that are trying to find a hole in what the professor said, or an inconsistency, or catch them in something that they don't know. And that actually asks very little from professor and from students. On the professor side, you can use your same notes for 20 years. Just, you bring them, you repeat, or well, so okay, not maybe for 20 years, but you can use more or less the same notes for a period of time. And then you adjust a bit here and there. And from the students, it doesn't require much because they don't have to read before they come to class, because the professor is there speaking for 50 minutes. And also because the only thing that you're trying to do is trying to push back again. So not even taking seriously whatever the professor has to say, or trying to, engage with the ideas. You're trying to catch the professor in something. And I loathe that way of teaching. I think it does nothing for the professor and it does nothing for the student. I think that the students should work with the materials autonomously, meaning there should be some previous reading that students have to do before they come. And I don't, stand in front of the class and synthesize the reading. I stand in front of the class and ask questions, not even necessarily about the readings, but that make them apply the ideas of the readings, or think about the ideas of the readings. Or so for example, how is McKinnon describing radical feminism? I'll show them a clip of a movie and then they have to relate it to the reading. So constantly engaging with the materials of the reading. So that's what I mean democratic. It's democratic in the sense that I don't stand up there and say, okay, McKinnon is saying this, and so this is McKinnon, this is her history, this is what she said, this is what she did. No, there is a point at which at the end of each class, or sometimes at the beginning of each class, in order to recap the last one, I make a little synthesis. So I say, we discussed this and that. These are your insights. This is what McKinnon, so that they have something to hold on to. But the initial thing is work autonomously with so that in that sense, it's democratic and it's also more egalitarian. But the other thing is that in order to teach in that way, you also have to be convinced that there's no a single answer to every question. That there could be different, and it happens if you are a professor who honestly takes this seriously, you realize that sometimes there are ways of reading something that are different than what you would propose, and then that's fine. And so it's in that way. It requires a lot of work on the students, because they have to come, read, engage, not be staring at their computers. And it requires a lot from the professor, because the professor has to be thinking, what are the things that I'm going to do in this classroom that are going to engage the students and make them understand what it's about. The constraints of teaching are, of course, that in mandatory courses, for example, you have to teach certain things. So but even there, so I had the experience, for example, when I went to law school, when I started working at Los Andes, I only taught theory, like public law theory, private law theory. And I have a colleague who I love a lot, and he's a very good friend. And he used to tell me, but you don't teach law. You have to teach something that is law, really. And I hated him. What are you talking about? But then I thought, no, in order to make other professors respect me, and not me like, one of the first women who's, who has a doctorate, who's teaching here full time. But she really doesn't know that much about anything. So that's why she teaches theory. So I wanted to teach administrative law. And then the administrative law professors was like, no, you can't teach administrative law. You don't know administrative law. Like if it were, I don't know, going to the moon or something really complicated. And I fought. I got to teach administrative law. And when I read the manual or the book, the doctrine book, it was so interesting. It had nothing to do with the real issues of administrative law at the time I was teaching. So it was all about, administrative law, it's imported from the French, and it's all about via gubernativa. But that had nothing to do with administrative law in the year 2005. Administrative law in the year 2005 had to do with the issues that consumers have with their water services, with their cell phone services, etc. So I think that that it's constraining because you have to teach some mandatory things, but that can also be liberating to understand what are the most important issues. And I would say in terms of emancipation, it was what I was talking about before, meaning trying to teach the students that the classroom is a democratic space where you should be engaged. I'm very attuned with, how women are feeling in the classroom, trying to promote women having their voice, young students having their voice in the classroom. And the last thing is a lesson from Duncan Kennedy, who of course had given me so many, but politicizing the classroom, which means don't shy away from, this has become a little more complicated, but still because of the contemporary situation. But in general, knowing that people are going to have political differences and allow them to, flesh them out in class. The last thing I would say about that is that the university is the last space we have to do this, right? You can't have an engaged and theoretical conversation in the street. If in a march, the place you can do it is in the classroom. And so I think that you also have to create spaces for people to engage with ideas, even if those ideas are opposing. But that engagement has to be informed, which is another. I tell my students, I'm not, and this may sound harsh, but I tell them, I'm not interested in your opinion in the classroom. I'm interested in your academic opinion. Outside of the classroom, I could be very interested in your personal opinion, but it's unacceptable for me to tell me that author is too left wing, that author is too right wing. I don't like that author because it's too difficult. No, if you're going to critique, then you have to have something more robust.
Great. And if I may ask, just a very small follow-up. In your classroom, is there any kind of vision of the law or of the role of law in society that you convey?
Of law in general, you mean?
Yes.
So that's a really interesting question. I actually had
And I know it's a very broad question, and we can talk about this for forever, but
no. But I do, for example, in France, I do have to say before I start and I teach in France only in English, and I have many French students, but it's a mixed group between French and non-French. But I do say, because sometimes students come with a view of law that law is what the law says, meaning the text of the law. The text of the law, doctrine, and what a judge has said. And I actually include in the definition or in my conception of law in the classroom what academics have said about law, what the way that bureaucrats are applying the law, but also the very beautiful life of the law, right? What is it? What happens to the law once it goes out there in the world, and what is the pushback, and I had a fantastic, I was her reader, but she did the doctorate degree at Los Andes, who had a whole thing about mothers who are who take care of children, and it's a state program and their interaction with the law. So I think that her name is Lina Uccelli. So I think that I make a very big effort to tell the students that law is much broader than simply, you know, the law in the books or legal interpretation or a legal doctrine.
Thanks. I wanted to go back a bit in the past. So I'm going to, so yeah, in 2019, if I remember well, we published a book in which you co-edited a book in which you wrote a chapter titled The Legal Architecture of Populism. And then you described how populism, what kind of constitutional form took populism in Latin America. You made a comparison of Colombia and Venezuela. And you said basically in the introduction and in the conclusion that the privileged constitutional form of legal populism in Latin America was like an overuse, a preference for referendum, the increasing power of the presidency, and a marked preference for legislation by executive order instead of by normal legislation in parliament. And that's made me think a lot about like one of the most renowned and problematic legal scholar of the 20th century, which is Carl Schmitt, who basically wrote a piece called Theory of the Constitution, where he said like the good constitution is this type of constitution. And Carl Schmitt was massively influential in Europe, even after his joining of the Nazi regime, because after the Second World War, he kept like having massive influence. He's the shadow father of the French Constitution, because, for example, things like that, and he has like massive influence also on Spanish constitutionalists. And of course, European, as you just mentioned, had also an impact on Latin America, because Latin America is always squeezed between the United States and the old colonial power. And I was wondering if you would say that the legal architecture that those problematic populist authoritarian regime are some kind of like avatars of European colonialism that is still exerted quite directly through ideas, so the episteme. And can we go as far as describing this phenomenon as constitutional colonialism? Because I mean, they exercise an influence and they have legitimacy, and often the voices of the global South are silenced, especially in the global North.
Thank you for that very interesting, very interesting question, which I must confess that I had not. So there are two pieces that are, I mean, this piece is about populism. It's in a book that this book I didn't edit. I wrote a chapter. I edited a book on neoliberalism as a form of constitutionalism, and I can talk a little bit about that. But when I wrote it, I had no idea about what you're just saying, meaning I didn't know, but now that I think about it, of course, there's many, like the centrality of the executive power is brought by France. I mean, that's true in Venezuela and it's true in Colombia. And so I would say that I had not thought about that dimension of it, and it's a brilliant one, and I completely agree. I had no idea that it was, structured by Schmidt. I think that that's also very interesting. And I do think that the European ideas, that Latin America, so an interesting thing about the way that I understood constitutional law in Latin America was that it was very influenced, or law in general, very influenced for a very long time, different branches of law by French law. So, for example, administrative law, constitutional law, Italian law, criminal law was, Italian law was very influential in criminal law, but also German law was also a bit influential. The civil code was French, etc. So in that way, that is like legal colonialism in a way. But there was also, and starting like so I wrote this piece one of the things that happens is that I have like a life in Spanish that is never, people who read in English don't know of my life in Spanish, but I wrote an article when I started to teach administrative law because I had to make my name in administrative law. I wrote an article, which is a bit a provocation, but to my other colleagues who taught administrative law, in which I said, you have always said that Colombian administrative law is French, that it's like an inheritor of French, which of course the people in the elite want to say that, right? We're not barbarians, we're exactly like the French. Look, we have this and that like the French. And I said, no, it's not true. Since the 1960s, I mean, it was true at some point, but since the 1960s, the ideas that have prevailed more have been American ideas. Because there was, or US ideas, not necessarily about administrative law, but influencing the way that administrative law is thought, is applied, etc. Through the idea of economic development, which is true. In the 1960s, there was the idea of import substitution industrialization. That's a completely administrative project. And so I said, oh, you guys, well, or less, but not exactly like that. Like, oh, everybody says that it's French, 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 but let me show you it's not French. It's actually a combination between French and the United States. And so in that sense, I think that we are a product of, you know, constitutional colonialism and neo-colonialism, if we included the US. But that, of course, is not the whole story. So Latin American scholar Diego Lopez, who I think probably Justina knows, had this beautiful work about misreading, which is that in Latin America, yes, we brought all of these ideas, but we also appropriated them through misreadings, right? And so we did things that are not just simply, you know, we brought them, we pasted them, that's it. So that's a long part to say. Thank you for the insight. I have not seen it that way, and I think I completely agree. But I don't think that when Chavez or Uribe sat down to do what they did, or especially, I mean, neither of them, but especially Chavez, who had this whole anti-imperial, anti-blah thing, anti-imperialist and thing about being Venezuelan, etc., that he was thinking, now I'm going to apply this tool that is actually a tool that comes from colonialism. I don't think they're conscious of it. And on the other side, I don't think that Uribe, when he applied the rules he applied, Uribe, I know for a fact, studied law, I'm not sure about Chavez, I don't think he was thinking, I'm going to do this because, of course, this is going to work better because it's French or whatever. But or German. I think it's like of the legal culture. So that's why your question is so interesting, and it's so insightful. One last thing about this piece is that what I wanted to say, I wanted to say all of these things, not the complexity that you just gave it, but the things that they're similar, was that it was a very important political move for me in a region where Chavez, or what they call Castro Chavismo, which they still call, whatever that is, it's like a unity between Fidel Castro and Hugo Chavez, who've been dead for ages. I wanted to say, this thing that you think is this monster out there, you're doing the same thing, right? And now, for example, with President Petro in Colombia, everybody's like, no, he's going to stay in power forever and ever. And I'm like, well, the first one who tried to stay in power forever and ever was right-wing Uribe. So for me, it was very important to see these things that you critique, the tools are the same. If you're on the right, if you're on the left, and the legal tools are exactly the same.
May I just
Sure.
one question? This is really interesting, like the legal tool are the same, and then like the gaze of like imperialist power being the United States or all the European countries. When they look, it's legal tools they also use, but when they use them, it's okay, it's democracy,
Yeah.
liberal democracy, but when the
Exactly.
other use them, they
Totally.
are barbarian.
Absolutely. Absolutely. This morning I said in the master class that if you described what Trump did during his presidency, but didn't say Trump. So this is a person who owns some hotels, and he would bring the presidents to those hotels who would have to pay. And then he went to Scotland and said, please take down those windmills because in my golf course I can't see, blah, 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 they would say, which banana republic president is that? And it was the United States president.
Or Emmanuel Macron.
Or Macron, yeah.
Fantastic. Should we do another question or?
I think if you wish, we can do.
Okay, great. So now moving on to your more recent work related to what you presented yesterday in your Max Weber lecture. So one of your the important themes in your works across the years involves the critique of the rights agenda in its very different manifestations. And I want to recall in particular here your work with Karen Engel on discussions surrounding the peace process in Colombia, which addressed the way in which discourses on human rights and anti-impunity were used to sideline or crowd out broader conversations about inequality of land and resources, which you two portray as being two contributors to the armed conflict in Colombia. So what I wanted to ask you is, what are the possibilities and limitations for granting rights to protect nature? And in your opinion, how do these possibilities and limitations relate to broader critiques of the limits of human rights or rights regimes?
Thank you. So it's interesting because in the last couple of days, I've talked much more about the critique of rights, but that hasn't necessarily been the way in which I have framed the issue always. I've framed the issue, I'm more interested in the critique of what everybody thinks is progressive, which is slightly different.
Right.
It turns out to be that now it's more, or that at times it has been about rights. In the case of, I'll talk a little bit about the rights to rivers, but in the case of transitional justice, the piece on impunity, it was very interesting to me that, and I later wrote something in Spanish precisely about this, which is that so the whole conversation was about criminal law. So the guerrilla members didn't want to go one day to jail. The Colombian elite said, this is inexcusable, they have to go. And then meanwhile, nobody was talking about, what was the original cause for the guerrilla to start, which is a country that had closed many forms of political participation in the 1960s, that has one of the highest, it is one of the most unequal countries in the world, et cetera, et cetera. And so there I was thinking it was progressive to believe in the peace process, right? Which I believed in it too. But it was progressive only if you talked about civil and political rights. About civil and political rights violations. But once you talked about social and economic conditions, then you became, it was impossible, you couldn't talk about that, etc. So much so that in the piece I wrote in Spanish, and I've always been fascinated by that, when the peace process started, President Santos, who was the president at the time, but also the leader of the negotiation table, had to go out again and again and say, the economic development model isn't being discussed, private property isn't being discussed, the relationship to the United States isn't being discussed. And I thought, so what are they discussing? I mean, what is, I wonder. And so I think that's like the first caveat I would like to say is that, and yesterday I was asked the question during the talk, somebody told me, how is this critique you're saying different from traditional critiques of human rights? And so one of the things I said is that in the case of granting rights to the environment, I don't want to stay only in the critique. I want to see the possibilities. For a very long time in my life, I was more about this is a critique. And also staying in my position as an academic, which is, I'm going to tell you what the critiques are, I'm going to tell you how it works, and you decide what you want to do. Now I want to be a bit more engaged because of the pressing issue of the environment, and also because I've changed politically too. I want to do more activism. I wish I could do some work with migrants in Paris. I mean, I want to, when I go back to Colombia, I want to do different things. Now the possibilities, one of the big possibilities in the granting rights to rivers is the term biocultural rights, which I find very interesting because it combines not only like the environmental aspect, but also how cultures relate to the places they live in, they inhabit. And that this means how they take care of nature, but also how they live nature, how they celebrate nature, how nature is a source of culture, it's a source of happiness, it's a source of it's sacred, it's etc. And also not necessarily as a site for production. So it's not only the river, even though I said previously that some communities want to produce things from the river, other communities just want the river because it's like it's part of themselves, it's their life.
Mhm.
And I like the term biocultural very, I think it could change the relationship to property. I think it could change that it's open. I'm not saying that in the ruling it has, but I'm thinking that you could open it in that way. I'm very interested in critiquing generally progressive laws. I used to be very interested in critiquing them more as a tool to show things,
Mhm.
but now I'm more interested in observing it as opportunities for action. So where you can disrupt, what things can you celebrate? What are the things, even if they're things that are not necessarily things that you would celebrate. So last week I was in a conference that I co-organized on law technologies and bodies. And as I think, I don't remember where the scholar was from. I mean, he's situated in France, but I can't remember if where he is, but he said, I want to celebrate forgery. So the people who make forgeries of passports,
Mhm.
and I want to celebrate smuggling. And I thought, wow, that's my agenda. Well, I mean, no, I'm not confessing to a crime, no. But I mean, no, but the idea of participating in ways that disrupt, the way that life is. So that would be my answer.
That's very compelling. Yeah.
Just a link with what you said just before, with the discussion about like, I mean, the after peace making in Colombia, and it was like saying like, they were not discussing economical situation and economic equality, economic violence, things like that. And I was, and then you have like this book, and I made a mistake. You are right, because I was confusing. Both on authoritarian constitutionalism, where you wrote a piece that linked directly neoliberalism to this capacity to think emancipation. And I was wondering if this discussion couldn't have happened in the frame of this neoliberal constitutionalism that is like that's enclosing us, and what is the path to get out from this imaginary, because I feel like we somehow abandoned a really long tradition of hope in revolution that was really lively in Latin America, and it seems to fade away because we live in a world where it's as if we are not able anymore, because it's constitutionalized, to see the violence of the economical system, and then if we cannot see its violence, we cannot oppose it, our own violence.
So thank you for that. I mean, I think that, so I have been really interested like in the revolutions, thing, like were the revolutions true revolutions? Who won and who lost in those revolutions? Very interested. Like I've read a lot about the Cuban Revolution, which is very interesting, but also the Bolivian Revolution in a way, the Venezuelan Revolution. My mother was half Venezuelan, so I've also looked at that. And I think that there's something about the revolution that is very beautiful, but there's also something that is very all-encompassing, right? Like we can only change completely if we do like this overhaul of revolution. And sometimes if you think, I mean, in the way I've studied it, I'm not saying everybody has to think that way, but in the way I've studied it, yes. And now I think that sometimes you can do revolutions like in your everyday life, right? Like a little bit, maybe it's age too, but For sure it's age, but it's also, you know, I'm doing this little thing today, which is important for me. And it's important for the person I did this favor to, or I was gentle to the bus driver, even though, you know, so I think that there's something, it's a bit Buddhist. It's like about here and now that I'm less into the big thing that we're going to overthrow the system and everybody has to, you know, change and it's more, yeah, they say that, well, Che Guevara had a whole thing about changing your own life. I'm not defending and so saying that, I'm just saying that this is also linked to left thinking, which is, let's not look at the huge thing, let's try to do something small so that's the first thing. The second thing is that I completely agree with you. And part of the reason why I wrote this neoliberalism as authoritarianism is that if there is something in which there are many, but one of the things in which neoliberalism has been very successful is in hiding the economics. Like, since there's only one way to do economics, then you can hide or put in the background big economic decisions. And when you can't, what do? Constitutional reform. So you block it. Now, the left has done that too, because Chavez also changed the constitution to do. Now there's a new constitution by Maduro, which I haven't looked into, but Chavez did change the constitution to like bulletproof his economic model. But I do think that this idea that what matters are civil and political rights and their protection, that social and economic issues should be taken care of by the market, completely makes it invisible and also doesn't allow you to see the violence that is there. One last thing about that is that in the transitional justice process, it was all civil and political rights violations, but not economic ones. And not economic ones in like ways that were, you know, what happens when your farm was taken away because you couldn't pay high interest rates. Yeah, that had nothing to do with the conflict of, you know, guerrilla paramilitary, but it's violent. It was a consequence of the, right? So I completely agree with you that there's like a blocking of the economics through this. And I think
Yeah, I think our time is up, but thank you, Elena, for this very illuminating and also versatile conversation touching on climate emergency, Castro-Chavismo, classrooms, legal colonialism. It was wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you too.
Yeah, thanks a lot.